The early morning mist clung to the fields as Napoleon's army prepared to strike. It was October 14th, 1806, and the French forces, led by the Emperor himself, were on the cusp of one of the most significant victories in their storied military history. Across from them, the once mighty Prussian army, steeped in tradition and confidence, stood ready for battle. What they didn't realize, however, was that they were about to face a force unlike anything they had ever encountered. A force led by a man who had already shattered the norms of warfare across Europe. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt would go down in history as a defining moment, one where the Prussian military machine, with all its legacy of Frederick the Great, would crumble before Napoleon's brilliance. The battle that unfolded that day didn't just mark the defeat of an army. It marked the collapse of a military doctrine that had dominated Central Europe for over a century. The Prussian army had long been considered one of the most formidable in Europe. Their tactics, discipline and efficiency were models of military excellence, and they had earned their reputation under the legendary Frederick the Great. But by 1806, Prussia had grown complacent. The army that once innovated and dominated European battlefields had stagnated. Meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte had revolutionized warfare with his rapid, flexible formations, his core system that allowed for independent action yet swift concentration of forces, and his relentless pursuit of enemy weakness. The backdrop to this confrontation was the Fourth Coalition, a loose alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia and Sweden, all determined to curtail Napoleon's growing influence across Europe. The Prussians, under King Frederick William III, had hesitated for too long in 1805 when Napoleon was busy defeating the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz. By 1806, spurred by a belated desire to confront Napoleon and reclaim their place at the head of European affairs, the Prussians decided to make their move. However, they faced a vastly different French army from the one Frederick the Great might have encountered decades earlier. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a finely tuned instrument of war. Its soldiers were hardened veterans, its commanders battle-tested and capable of independent decision-making. Napoleon himself was a military genius, always thinking several moves ahead, constantly adapting to the ever-changing dynamics of battle. As the Prussians marched to meet Napoleon, they were already at a disadvantage. Divided into two main forces, one under Prince Hohenlohe and the other under the Duke of Brunswick, the Prussian army lacked cohesion. Their battle plans were outdated, their movements slow and predictable. Napoleon, meanwhile, moved with lightning speed. His army, marching in corps, could react and adapt in ways the Prussians couldn't match. On the morning of October 14th, 1806, two battles would be fought near the towns of Jena and Auerstedt, located only a few miles apart, but both decisive in their own right. Napoleon, unaware that the bulk of the Prussian army under Brunswick was actually at Auerstedt, believed the main Prussian force to be at Jena, where Prince Hohenlohe was stationed with about 40,000 troops. Confident in his numbers and tactical advantage, Napoleon prepared to crush what he thought was the primary Prussian force. Meanwhile, at Auerstedt, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, commanding a single French corps of around 27,000 men, stumbled upon Brunswick's main army of over 60,000 Prussians. What followed was an extraordinary display of French tenacity and leadership. Despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, Davout held his ground, employing brilliant defensive tactics to blunt the Prussian attacks. As the Prussians attempted to press their advantage, Davout's soldiers repelled their assaults time and time again, using the terrain to their benefit and launching counterattacks at critical moments. Back at Jena, Napoleon's battle unfolded with characteristic precision. At around 6 a.m., he launched his initial assault on Hohenlohe's forces, pushing the Prussians back with a combination of infantry and artillery fire. Hohenlohe, unable to comprehend the speed and ferocity of the French attack, was soon overwhelmed. French cavalry, led by Marshal Joachim Murat, swept across the battlefield, cutting down Prussian soldiers as they fled in disarray. The Prussian command structure, rigid and slow to react, crumbled under the relentless French advance. By midday, Napoleon's forces had seized the heights overlooking Jena, and from there they unleashed a devastating artillery barrage on the retreating Prussians. The Prussian army, caught between French artillery and cavalry, broke apart. Hohenlohe's forces, reduced to a fleeing rabble, were pursued by French cavalry, who harried them mercilessly. Napoleon's victory at Jena was absolute. He had destroyed Hohenlohe's army, killing or capturing thousands of Prussian soldiers and sending the remnants scattering in all directions. But even as Napoleon celebrated his victory at Jena, the true miracle of the day was unfolding at Auerstedt. Davout, against all odds, had not only held his position, but had decisively defeated Brunswick's much larger Prussian force. The Prussians, stunned by the resilience and discipline of the French corps, were forced into a chaotic retreat. Brunswick himself was mortally wounded in the fighting, and his death further disorganized the Prussian command. What should have been a crushing defeat for Davout turned into one of the most remarkable victories of the Napoleonic Wars. By the end of the day, both Prussian armies were in full retreat. The once proud Prussian military, with its legacy of Frederick the Great, had been shattered in a single day. Over 40,000 Prussian soldiers were killed, wounded or captured, compared to around 12,000 French casualties. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was a complete and utter disaster for Prussia. Their army, their pride and their military tradition had been humiliated by a faster, smarter and more flexible opponent. In the aftermath of the battle, the consequences for Prussia were severe. Napoleon's forces, buoyed by their victories, pressed their advantage, marching toward Berlin. The Prussian capital fell within weeks, and Napoleon entered the city as a conqueror. The defeat at Jena-Auerstedt marked the collapse of the old Prussian military system. The rigid, inflexible doctrines that had served them well in the 18th century were now hopelessly outdated in the face of Napoleon's modern, adaptable warfare. The Prussian king, Frederick William III, was left with no choice but to flee eastward, seeking refuge with his Russian allies. But even they could not stop Napoleon's march across Europe. The Prussian army, once the envy of Europe, was now a broken shell of its former self. Reforms would eventually come, but for the time being, Prussia's power had been decisively crushed. Napoleon, ever the master of propaganda, wasted no time in celebrating his victory. He issued proclamations throughout Europe, boasting of his triumph and the destruction of the Prussian army. His reputation, already formidable after victories at Austerlitz and elsewhere, grew even larger. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of Central Europe. With Prussia defeated, he turned his attention to the rest of the continent, consolidating his power and preparing for future campaigns. But the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was more than just a military victory for Napoleon. It was a symbol of the changing face of warfare. The old, rigid tactics of 18th century armies were no match for Napoleon's innovative strategies. His ability to move troops quickly, concentrate force at critical points, and adapt to the changing dynamics of the battlefield set him apart from his contemporaries. The Prussians, by contrast, had relied on outdated tactics, slow communication, and rigid command structures, all of which had contributed to their downfall. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt would also have lasting consequences for the future of Prussia. In the wake of their humiliating defeat, Prussian leaders realized that their army needed to change. The military reforms that followed, led by figures like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau, would eventually lay the groundwork for the revitalization of the Prussian army. These reforms, which emphasized flexibility, meritocracy, and modern tactics, would come to fruition years later during the Wars of Liberation, and would play a key role in Prussia's eventual resurgence as a major European power. For now, however, the memory of Jena-Auerstedt lingered like a dark shadow over Prussia. It was a defeat that exposed the weaknesses of the old order and underscored the need for change. Napoleon's victory had shown that the future of warfare belonged to those who could adapt, innovate, and think strategically. The Prussians had learned this lesson the hard way, and it would take years for them to recover from the devastation of that fateful day. In the grand scope of the Napoleonic Wars, The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt stands as one of Napoleon's greatest triumphs. It was a battle that showcased his tactical brilliance, his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies, and his relentless drive for victory. For the Prussians, it was a day of reckoning, a moment when they were forced to confront the reality that their once mighty army was no longer the dominant force in Europe. As Napoleon's troops marched triumphantly into Berlin, the message was clear. The age of Frederick the Great was over. A new era of warfare had dawned, one dominated by Napoleon Bonaparte and his Grande Armée. The legacy of Jena-Auerstedt would endure for years, serving as a reminder of both Napoleon's genius and the dangers of complacency in a world that was rapidly changing.